Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about ecological succession. By the end of this video, I'd like you to be able to answer these two questions. What are the differences between primary and secondary succession? And be able to explain how disturbances in nature can be viewed in both a positive and a negative way. So your first objective is to get an idea of this concept of what succession actually is. As you can see in these pictures down here, and based on this definition, succession is basically changes over time. So if we look at time being a major factor, it's how the landscape changes over time. If you need a second to pause and read through this definition, you can. So you can see visually here what some of these major changes are over time. Basically, some of the key concepts we're going to talk about today is this starting point where we have some kind of disturbance. And then it's this process of going from an earlier stage in any area. It could be a forest, it could be a lake, it could be within the desert, and how the changes in the vegetation, the biomass, the soil, that includes animals, and everything else that lives in this area is just changing over time. And usually you're going to see that this process is basically increasing in terms of biomass, biodiversity, and soil. So normally this process of succession is starting off with some kind of empty space or bare space. It could either be bare rock or it could be just soil in this area. Then the first thing that happens here, if we zoomed in on this, we'd see all these little organisms starting to come in here, plants and everything like that, and we call those the pioneer species. Those are the species that can usually come very quickly after some kind of disturbance. After the pioneer species are there, they help to do things like build more soil. So we see our soil layers are increasing, which means that we have more nutrients in the area. And if we have more nutrients in the area, the availability of nutrients allows more organisms to live in that area. Once we have more food, we're increasing both biomass with the actual food that's there. Once we have all of these primary producers in this area, then we can start to get other organisms that are there, small organisms like insects, maybe small rodents, and they'll start to really increase a lot of the nutrient flow within this system. As we start to move up our chain and later on in time, remember this is basically our time keeps going here. So this might be at year 0. And this might be 200 years later. So it's a long time that this is happening. So at 200 years later, we get to this final stage here, and we refer to this as our climax community. Now, at the climax community, this can either stay intact for a long time, or we could have, again, some kind of disturbance, which could put us back to our starting point, which means we would have to start this process over again. So let's break down this process a little bit further. So one of the key ideas here is breaking down this idea of primary versus secondary succession. Primary succession is usually this idea that there is nothing left in this land. For example, in this case, this is one of the Galapagos Islands, and the Galapagos are formed mainly with volcanoes. So in the process of a volcano erupting, we have all of this lava that's left over, and it's bare rock. It is brand new, there's nothing there, there's no soil, there's nothing. And very few things can live in this space. If you zoom in and start to take a really close look, you might find that there are just a few plants and other organisms that can start to adapt to that really harsh environment. In this example, this is just salt water, there's very little natural fresh water, there's very little nutrients, there's very little soil. But as we start to have a little bit of soil breaking down for different reasons like the simple weathering of this area, you start to have just enough nutrients for something like this tough species of cacti living in this area. Secondary succession is the idea that we already have soil in place. So some kind of disturbance happens and we have soil in place, and as most of you should know, once we have soil, we have the available nutrients for most plant life to start to take hold within an area. Another big concept we're wondering about here are what kinds of disturbances we might be referring to. Well, disturbances could be both natural and they could be man-made. So natural or man-made, natural could be things like a volcano or possibly a forest fire, which could also be man-made, or possibly something like habitat destruction. So any of these disturbances would essentially clear off the land and put us back to that first stage. In this picture you can see a lot of grass, but behind you see it's all really dark. Now, lately I've been living in places that have had a lot of forest fires, and immediately following this disturbance of a forest fire, you can see one of the pioneer species that would come back in this case are these grasses, because their roots don't get destroyed and they're able to grow back really quickly. And of course, this case would be a secondary succession form because we have soil remaining in this place. Another case is that forest fires often can help to open up something like a pine cone here. And when a forest fire happens, some species of conifers, they require that heat for these pine cones to open up and release their seeds. So forest fires can actually be a natural process that these trees have evolved with in order to reproduce. So you can see some of these disturbances, they can have an obviously negative effect. And forest fires as well, if they destroyed land that humans had established, they would also have a pretty negative view. However, these processes can allow for the process of succession to keep occurring. If we didn't have forest fires, there are certain plants that they couldn't reproduce anymore because we've stopped forest fires. So this is kind of a big issue here of these three. Some things that humans have tried to suppress over many, many years. Forest fires actually have a beneficial effect on the environment in a lot of ways because they help to regenerate nutrients in an area, and they help to clean out a space where other species can then move in. So there's other controversies where we have to really look at both the positives and the negatives of our actions or natural actions to see if we should allow them to happen or not. One final type of succession that we can talk about is something called aquatic succession. Now, aquatic succession is this idea that if we have a lake or a water body, as all of this water comes down in here, you can also notice there's a lot of soil back in this space. These soil particles, they don't just stay there. They fall into this lake, and what happens over hundreds and thousands of years is you can see in this series of pictures, all of these types of soil that are falling into this lake start to build up, and we have the sediment developing on the bottom of this lake, and slowly you can start to see how the developed sediment fills in this lake, and the amount of water gets less and less and less over time. So we have less water in this lake, and we have more soil filling in this lake. And over the course in this picture of 150 years, you can see how the lake went from a normal lake, and then it filled in with so much sediment that all of a sudden we have a different habitat, a different type of ecosystem in this place, where if you lived in this area 150 years ago, or if you live there today, you might not know what used to be in that place. And it's a really great way to see how succession can impact an area over a long period of time. So my last challenge to you would be to actually go out in your neighborhood, and you can see succession all over the place. From something as simple as a little bit of grass growing up in the middle of a sidewalk can indicate that succession is happening, where you've gone from a bare surface and just a little bit of soil started to fill in that place, which could allow for succession to happen. So if you watch any of those TV shows about things like Life After People, where they show how the world will continue without human influence, succession is a process that's always been happening and will continue to happen no matter what kind of impacts we have on the planet. So if you can now, go back and double check again. Can you answer these questions? What are the differences between primary and secondary succession? And can you see ways that disturbances in nature can be viewed both positively and negatively? Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you learned something new.